because Christianity is countercultural. It's not cultural. So we're not doing the same thing as Beyonce, trying to reflect the culture and then build on that. We're actually doing something different. We're listening to Jesus as he has set up a new framework, which sometimes can be confronting for adults and for young people. So we're not just trying to, as Karen said, we're listening to young people and encouraging them to listen to God. So not just listen to us, but we're all trying to listen to what God has to say.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is fantastic to have you along with us, whether you're listening or watching. And I am joined, as usual, by Stu. How are you, Stu?
Hello, Joel.
And we have a special guest with us. Joining us today is Callan, the teaching pastor of Soul Revival Church. Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. It's lovely to have you on here. Are you excited?
I am. It's going to hang on for the ride, I think.
That's good. Now, we are, as usual, in this season talking about ministering in the 2010s and the 2020s. And we're looking at that through the lens of different musical artists that have shaped that time. Now, guys, I'm quite excited about this one because I've done a lot of research and I've been very interested in this particular artist, which is Beyonce. Which is she high at the top of your playlist, Karen?
No, I can't say that she is. You asked me earlier of, am I a honeybee or a killer bee? I didn't even know what the references meant, so I'm sorry, no.
We'll get on that. That's great, because we'll get on to that later about who the BeyHive, as they call it, or is her most avid fans.
Yeah.
Stu, any plans to put Beyonce into your rotation?
Yeah, I don't mind listening to Beyonce songs, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that I'm a fan and I'm right over the top of all her discography. I'm not right over the whole canon of Beyonce, but I do enjoy songs from time to time. I like to Put a Ring on It. That's a fun song.
Is it?
I mean, there's songs I'm certainly familiar with. They're not on my playlist.
Well, we hear it. That's the thing, isn't it? It's like we hear her a lot, but maybe she's not probably your favourite artist.
No, she's very talented, and I really appreciate her ability. Yeah.
I think she's an exceptional artist. I think she's quite amazing in the amount of work that she has put out. I think it's exceptional. And we talk about always on the Shock Absorber. I know that, Karen, you've listened to a lot of Shock Absorbers. You've been very kind to. But you would know that we always talk about a cultural artefact.
Yes.
Stu, you mentioned Single Ladies. Is there a reason that you like that song?
I really like it. I don't know. When it comes on the
it is very catchy.
It just gets me thinking it's a fun song. Yeah, it's good.
So you did put a ring on a single lady at some point.
I did put a ring on a single lady, actually. That is true, yes. Louise has a ring on her finger. Yes.
It's got a ring. Yeah, that's great. It has got a very interesting film clip where it's all done in black and white.
Right.
And then they've got that special dance that's very popular with everyone, when it goes, oh, 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 oh.
That's a bit of the song I like.
Yeah. We'll get to see if Dave, the producer, can chuck in a few clips of that because it's quite an exceptional.
Yeah, I reckon it's a really catchy song, actually.
Yeah,
really
it is.
Really very catchy.
You enjoy it? You enjoy it? Karen?
When it comes on, it is definitely gets my attention.
Gets you
I
moving?
can't see that I get into the dance, but yeah.
We might have to learn it.
We may all have to learn.
We could do a special edition of the Shock Absorber where we choreograph an episode.
Yeah, probably the lowest views we've ever got if we do that.
Probably.
What was cool though is that the reason that we chosen Beyonce is that one of the 5 artists that YouTube channel Polyphonic, run by a musical journalist in Canada, he chose to five artists, and she is one of them. And interestingly, he describes Beyonce as a pure cultural force, which I think is really interesting. And then goes on to say, she ascended to the throne of pop music. More than just a critical success, Beyonce became part of and helped to drive the political discussions of the era, which is around that 2010, 2020 time. I thought should we get into a little bit of background about Beyonce first, so we kind of know where she's coming from.
I think just before you do that, I think it's a really cool phrase that's used on that Polyphonic YouTube, because it's really helpful for our purposes as we're trying to get our head around how our culture has changed in the last 10 years and where it might be going. And to have an artist like Beyonce is really helpful signpost towards quite significant cultural change, as she's been pointing to it and part of making that change. So I think going back and looking at her career would be really helpful.
Yes.
And choosing that song is interesting too, from the perspective that, like all of us, she's a complex human being who, through her art, you can see some of the major influences and her interests. And so, you know, there's themes of the fact that she's singing about put a ring on it. There's sort of some themes of morality in there, as well as other things, feminism and other things that come out in her music. So, yeah, it's an interesting place to start.
Well, it's also just as we've looked at Taylor Swift and David Bowie. They do the same thing. It's their experiences of their lives, depending on their age, experiences, and everything that's gone on. You see how that translates into their music and how it changes and adapts over time. So I think Beyonce is doing that as well. But she was born in Houston, Texas. That's where she started. Her maiden name was Beyonce Knowles, and then it became Knowles Carter after she married Jay-Z. Became a very big power couple in probably an even more of a cultural force. And then so she originally started in a group called Destiny's Child, which we would probably all heard plenty of songs from there. They were originally called Girls Time, but then
I didn't know that.
But that started in 1990. So she's
really?
So she has been performing in a group since she was 9 years old.
Wow.
Which is, there's a lot going, there's a lot of experiences to talk about there. They signed their first record deal in 1997 and then ended up disbanding in 2006. So then she went on to her solo career when she released the first album that came out was called Dangerously in Love in 2003, but people would definitely know the song Crazy in Love, which is a very popular song, you know, with Jay-Z. And I did hear an interesting story about that song, was that the night before she had to turn that album in to her record company, she was like, I don't know what's going on. Her and Jay-Z had entered into a relationship about a year prior to that on a 03 Bonnie and Clyde, which is a song by Jay-Z. But she's like, there's just something missing in Crazy in Love. So 3 o'clock in the morning, she calls Jay-Z in the night before she has to turn the album in, and then says, can you put a line in? He improvises the whole thing.
Just there on the spot.
Yep, and that's what they released in the album and the single, which was pretty wild. I mean, it shows how good an artist Jay-Z is.
Very talented. Yeah, it shows the talent, doesn't it?
Yeah,
to
exactly.
be able to do that. And to recognise that there's something missing. You know, for her to know this song's not ready. That's something I also picked up, is that there's sometimes a little bit of conjecture about how many songs she wrote and all that kind of stuff, because she works with lots of different producers. But then there's a vast array of those producers saying, no, she's an incredible artist and writer in her own right, but she's a really collaborative. Like, she really wants to get other people's ideas. So she's done that across her career. The other thing that was interesting, though, that in 2010, she released quite a few albums. So there was let me just have a look. There's Dangerously in Love we talked about, then B-Day in 2006, and then 2008 with a album called I Am Sasha Fierce. And that seemed to mark a bit of a turning point in her career. So she went on a big globe-trotting tour. So she took a 9-month hiatus. She travelled around Europe, Australia. She went and saw the Great Wall of China, Egyptian pyramids, went to English music festivals.
That's cool.
She actually ended the management relationship with her father. So her father was the ones that was managing Destiny's Child and also her career up until that point. And then, so it was a real turning point, as I said. And then she actually recorded 60 songs after that traveling time, because she wanted to get lots of experiences, and then whittled that down into 12, which became her album 4. And that was actually her attempt, and very much like Taylor Swift and David Bowie we've talked about before, that she wanted to change the sound on radio. Like, it was almost like she was, you remember we've talked about 2 episodes ago, Stu, that David Bowie was passing the baton on to the new artists, and perhaps the end of the rock god myth and all that kind of. It's almost like she was picking up. She's like, I need to be the one that changes music now. So then, checking the discography, she then releases it's called 4 in 2011, and then we enter really into the 2013s, where there is another almost shift into how she's putting out music. So in 2013, there was an album called Beyonce that she released in December, and that was a surprise album drop. No one knew it was happening. So, and every song, there was 14 of them, had its own music video, and then it dealt with a lot more darker themes than she'd really talked about before. And then April 2016 is Lemonade, and that's one of her most critically acclaimed albums. And that was, in my opinion, when I was listening to her music, that was my favorite album, because I thought it was just a very, very interesting perspective on a lot of things. It was dealing with a lot of things about Jay-Z, and I thought it was a fantastic album. I actually listened to it twice through because I really enjoyed it. And then she went into another phase almost where she starts doing what she calls visual albums. So it was a lot of paired with documentaries. There was The Homecoming, which is a Netflix documentary that has a live album as well that comes with that, and I'm sure we can get into these later. But then there's also the final visual album that she released last year in 2020, which was Black is King. So in looking across the discography, she's had a very storied career, and it continues, obviously. It's almost like there's 3 stages in that discography, Stu. Would you agree with that?
Again, like I don't pretend to be an expert on Beyonce, but I'm really interested how she has that early stage of her career, like when she's in Destiny's Child and she's sort of discovering who she is, so to speak, and then the 2000s is kind of a new period of time where she goes out on her own. But then in 2010, which is the period we're most interested in, 2010 up to now, there seems to be a marked change. She's incredibly successful. She's just won some more Grammys, and the 2008 album was really quite well received by the critics and by the public as well. And that's when she starts to, I think, find her voice even more, and she starts to speak out on issues of feminism and Black Lives Matter and interesting issues of culture that we will get to a bit later. But that early stage I find really fascinating, how the backstory of how her dad got her into music, and that story of their family. I don't know if you guys know much about that background, but I find that really interesting.
Yeah, so I believe that her mum and dad were very much integral to her career. They, I think she was doing talent shows from even before she was part of the original Destiny's Child lineup. So it's very much into that space of doing talent shows, trying to get noticed, and a lot of. I think there would probably be a lot of pressure going on in that environment. And then it's interesting that in that next section, she felt she needed to break away from her dad's management. And it's interesting that seems to happen with a lot of people who have managed to find a large amount of success. Like we talk about maybe Tiger Woods is someone that his dad was very much pushed him to be a golfer and drove him really, really hard. Someone else I think of is Lewis Hamilton, the Formula One driver. His dad was very integral in getting his career started, helping him get there. I know that Lewis Hamilton's dad, he had 4 jobs at one time just to pay for his motorsport career. So, but then he felt that to move on to the next stage of his career, he had to move away from being in his dad being in his inner circle all the time and all that kind of thing. So it's a theme that often happens with very successful people, Karen.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to reflect on who's driving the activity, because I think we all would probably be able to think of examples of people who are driven, but it's the parents who are passionate about that thing and they're driving their children. And then others who it's the child who's really interested in the thing, and the parents do everything they can to support that passion that the child has. And I think it's interesting that obviously Beyonce is someone who is very driven and has gone on from breaking that relationship of management with her father to be even more driven. So, you could probably, maybe there was drive from both parties. But I just remember reflecting on my own life. There was a time in my life where I was really wanted to be a doctor, and I was really considering going down that path, but I couldn't work out, because it was also my mother's passion. I couldn't work out if it was my drive or my mum's, and so I ended up not doing it. And I think it's interesting looking at these types of people who have gone on to be really successful at the thing they started, and what is the thing that's driving them. But she's obviously very, I know that later on we'll probably get into talking about, she was very passionate about trying to do something new and make a difference in the world. And so I think you can see that drive right from the beginning. Yeah,
it's really fascinating. And you can see that, like, she's continued to have a thriving career after that decision. Yeah. But then you look at some other artists that have had a similar situation with their father or whatever driving them, or parents driving them. Like the Britney Spears story is very tragic and sad that at the moment that story is still being played out as Britney tries to get away from the influence of the father. And also there's that really negative impact that Michael Jackson's father had on him when he was growing up. In the Jackson 5, he was obviously driven really hard in the 70s, and although he obviously had a very successful career in the 80s, he also had a really dramatic fall as well. So it can be quite toxic as well. But Beyonce seems to be thriving in a really healthy way in her attempt to express herself and take control of her life, I think.
Whether that time that she ended the management situation with her father, the album at that time in 2008 was the same year that she decided to end that management with him. That was I Am Sasha Fierce, the album, and she created a portion of that album to be an alter ego. And so perhaps she said in interviews later on that she needed to create that person or that persona in order to help find herself. And then later on she said, I'm done with that persona. Like I now have discovered myself, which is kind of what you're talking about. Like it might have been
work it out. Is it mine? Is it my parents? And that alter ego she obviously used to help her answer that question.
And also got married to Jay-Z in that year as well.
So in 2008? Yeah.
So it's a very pivotal year for her, it seems.
Actually, that was the year I got introduced to Jay-Z.
Did you?
If I remember correctly. Yeah, I was at a U2 concert in Sydney and Jay-Z came on as a support act. I think it was 2008.
He was, yep. But I thought you were introduced to him personally. Like he's like, this is Sean Carter.
Yeah, it was. I just stood there in the crowd while he finished his act, so I could get onto U2. So I wasn't appreciating the moment at the time. But now I look back on that and I think, wow, that was 2008. Like that was a big year in his life. And I came to understand his music a bit later on, but I was not aware of the import of it at the time.
And another inspiration and driving force for her, I think, because she constantly references him as an inspiration to her as well, because he's done the same thing. He's come from a very difficult background and upbringing of running drugs and all that kind of thing, and then became an incredibly successful artist, but has also raised up a whole lot of artists behind him too. So Kanye West owes a lot to Jay-Z as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because we're going to get on to Kanye West in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right.
In the podcast, yeah.
So then that's the turning point, is that then as we get into the 2010s, she's got 3 albums that all went platinum. The 4, as we spoke about before, had she starts to talk about a lot of important issues such as feminism. She's got the song "Run the World, Girls," and maybe that came out that she was traveling the world prior to that, and she felt like she wanted to change the world and had the ability to. She had the voice and the platform to do that. Then 2013, Beyonce, that album is a surprise drop. She thinks but she's built up such a back catalogue of work that she feels like she can drop it. And then, as I said, in 2016, Lemonade is an album basically about Jay-Z's infidelity, which is a fantastic, not a fantastic situation, sorry, but it's a fantastic insight into how she was feeling at the time. I don't know if you've listened to any of those albums, but in Lemonade she partners with people like Kendrick Lamar and even Jack White, who's one of my favorite artists, and that's actually my favorite song on the album. But it's talk about don't hurt yourself, and it's like, if you hurt me, you'll end up hurting yourself anyway. So she's really delving into a lot more difficult and harder to maybe express situations and subjects. But then she's actually really making it a real important part of her life and letting people get access into that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that particular time.
Oh, I think that's really interesting, Joel. I love it that she goes on holidays to break away from that Sasha Fierce persona that she's developed to help her to find her voice, that she then goes on a holiday and she finds a voice after that holiday. But what I find fascinating about the holiday, she writes 60 songs while she's on holiday, and then she's able to take 12 of those that are so good that she can make the next album come out after she's been on holiday. So I think that's a real insight into her work ethic and her ability and capacity. It's incredible. That shift towards finding her own voice and then looking to bring change, I think, is a big theme for her in the 2010s. And I think it is a theme of the 2010s that we've identified that interestingly, like David Bowie had different personas. She started off with that, and then she changes out of that. And we talked about Black Star, David Bowie's last album in the 2010s, where he almost says, this is the end of the rock god myth from the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and now there's a new generation coming up. And we see in Beyonce what that new generation is saying and who they are. So while she does that, she moves away from that idea of having a persona like David Bowie did, and even Taylor Swift had that persona as well. And she's herself, and now we hear her voice, and she's really interested in those issues you raised.
I wonder though whether she is herself. Like, I think one of the things that I observe happen often for women is, and she's going through this process of trying to identify who she is and what's the difference that she wants to make in the world, and she's broken away from the influence of a male figure in her life, a significant one, her father. That I think sometimes what happens is you see a pendulum swing that, and I know that Beyonce's been criticised for being quite aggressive in this album, really assertive in, sort of saying women can change the world. But I think sometimes it's the exploration of how do we do it? And I think that she's making a statement about that as well. And, obviously we know across the world the difference that girls can actually make when they're empowered in the world. In, sort of the aid and development world, it's really clearly known that you give aid to a girl and it influences the whole community. And so, I think it's interesting that watching those pendulum swings, that trying to break out of, or identify how do I make a difference in the world, that sometimes it can go a bit far. And so it'll be interesting to see it as she continues to have that influence and that political voice, whether it'll continue to be as aggressive or whether she'll find her way of being able to share a message in a way that's palatable, but and maybe more people will engage with. But obviously, she has no problem with engaging a lot of people in following that. But I think when you've been in a situation where there's a form of barrier, oppression, whatever, as you try and break out of that and find your voice, it can be a bit clunky sometimes.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we sometimes have really high expectations of the people that we follow, and sometimes we put them on a pedestal. But it's good to recognise that we're all humans and that we're all having a go. And she's obviously able to make a new start, like musically and also politically, I suppose. But like musically, she really started off by wanting to shift the radio style and really change popular music, which in and of itself is a massive thing. Like, for her to have the confidence to do that and then do it, like in that album she does, but then also to then speak into those topics that up until that time weren't really spoken about that much. I don't know what your thoughts on that, Karen, are, but I think she's helped to create a space for people to talk about these things.
In a similar way that you guys were talking about last week with Taylor Swift. It's not just her own voice. She's trying to create a platform for other people to have a voice too. And she definitely starts the sort of feminism tilt, I think is evident in there. But it's not just about her voice. It's trying to give women and girls, encourage girls to step up and have a voice. Yeah,
and that's such a significant tilt too, and a significant new stage of feminism that we now talk about a third wave feminism in the 21st century. That there was the first wave feminism with the suffragettes in the early days, and then there was the 70s with the second wave feminism, which was making huge important strides, and now there's a new wave of feminists coming through. So I suppose Beyonce is part of that.
Yeah.
In 2013, in an interview in Vogue, she said she considered herself to be a modern day feminist and would later align herself more publicly with the movement, sampling something that a Nigerian author, but now I'm going to try and get this name right, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and there's a sample on one of her songs that said, "We should all be feminists," and that was from a TED talk. It was in the song "Flawless." Sorry. So she is obviously in that time starting to align herself, but also it seems to be, as you said, Karen, exploring the ways to do that rather than I know exactly how to do this. I think because then after aligning herself with all those different. Not all those, a number of movements. Then you get to that point in Lemonade in 2016 where she's like, my husband has been unfaithful. Now what do I do? And it's dealing with another problem that obviously a lot of people in the world have dealt with and can identify with that. And then the next album is actually her and Jay-Z release an album together as a new, almost like a new artist, as called the Carters, which is saying, we're actually back together, and the album's called Everything Is Love. And then in 2019 she does Homecoming, which is basically, I see it as a thing of like, I'm back to where I was, and I'm more of who I am, but also I'm a much more developed person and artist. Because the reason, the Netflix line is, this intimate, in-depth look at Beyonce's celebrated 2018 Coachella performance reveals the emotional road from creative concept to cultural movement. But then she called it homecoming because there's that traditional event in America at colleges and churches and schools where there's a tradition of welcoming back former students and members. So that's why, if you actually watch it, she's got these huge metal bleachers behind her, full of like big band, like with the drums and a lot of brass instruments and stuff. And she's dancing in front of it, and it's basically saying, "I'm back to the person who I wanted to be." And then, but also bringing all those things that she's learned through all the learnings into that performance, it's a fantastic performance. I really enjoyed watching. I don't know if you've caught it, Stu, but you might like to.
No, yeah, it's interesting. I haven't got to the documentary and that yet, but that's interesting that how she articulated that breakup with Jay-Z, Karen. It's like a very public and a painful thing.
It's really
for
brutal.
I suppose.
Some of the lyrics.
Yeah.
I don't know if have you listened to any of the songs.
No, I mean, possibly, but no, I don't. Not that I'm aware of. But I from hearing people speak about it, she was very raw emotionally and sharing that. But again, I think the album shows a journey, doesn't it, through the pain of it, acknowledging and being very real about the pain of infidelity, of being let down like that, someone that you thought you could trust, that's broken, to coming to the point of sort of overcoming that obstacle and there being redemption on the other side of it. I think it's an interesting, and thinking about the influences, obviously she has a background where there is some faith influences in there, and so there's a bit of a which is a statement that's quite countercultural. Our culture would expect and tells us that when, if you're in a relationship and there's an affair, it ends in destruction. It doesn't end in redemption. And so this was quite a statement, putting it on an album to show it doesn't have to be that way. I'm making a statement against that culture that says, actually, there's place for redemption on the other side of this.
Yeah. Wow, it's fascinating. Yeah. It's very strong again, isn't it? Like it just is very admirable to see her to be able to
be
reconcile
and vulnerable,
and at the same time
very
be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like it's incredible. Like she's not only trying to sort things out behind the scenes. I mean, we all know that in our personal lives things can get really chaotic and incredibly emotionally draining, and to be able to continue to produce art in that context is amazing, and to produce art about that topic is quite amazing.
Yeah, not to wait till you've worked through it and then reflect back on it, but to actually be raw in the moment and share that. Yeah.
And we were talking about with Taylor Swift last week that the way to connect with the audience, one of the sociologists we were looking at before, Ian Hussey, was saying that you can look at cultures through certain lenses and see certain themes coming out of cultures. And one of the themes that we're seeing again this week that we saw last time with Taylor Swift is this idea of egalitarianism, that like this openness to share your personal life with people is very, as we'll talk about in a minute, very postmodern. That it's not a very modern thing to show your private life to the world, but it's a very egalitarian impulse to say to your fans, I'm going to bring you on this journey with me. They feel a lot more connected to her as a result, and she has done that in a sustainable way that hasn't ended up destroying her. I mean, the public gaze can actually be incredibly consuming. I mean, at the moment there's a lot of controversy around Netflix's new depiction of Diana, and obviously we know that Diana, Princess Diana, had a dreadful relationship with the media, and it was almost like you were watching her trying to live a private life, but they're constantly trying to pry the windows open and open the blinds to see into her life, and this constant gaze of the photographers that ended up leading to being a major factor towards her death, that they were chasing her into a tunnel and to try and find out some kind of information about her. And now there's a controversy around, should Harry say more about Netflix depicting his mother in a negative light even. So even after she's passed away, there's still this constant narrative around who is Diana? How much should we know? What should we say about her life? But what's fascinating about Taylor Swift and Beyonce is they've actually opened the doors to their life and opened the windows and opened the blinds, and there's almost like, I'm sure there's a lot of paparazzi around her and trying to get glimpses of her life, but it's a bit harder for them to be in control of her if she's in control of the narrative. So I think it's fascinating that as she says in the song Run the World, she says, girls run the world, my persuasion can run the nation. And I think that's really interesting, that sense of being in control is something you can observe in Lemonade, that she's in control of this situation where she's a very public figure and she's having a real turmoil in her private life, and yet she's able to balance that. It's incredibly strong. It's an incredible strength there.
And perhaps this way,
but it's a new way of dealing with it, isn't it? It is that, thing that David Bowie was saying. There's going to be a new generation that does things differently, and one of the things is the private life and the public life is very blurred.
And perhaps that's the way she's manages it herself, is by if I can control the narrative, then I can at least have people prying to the parts I don't want people to pry into. I know that she rarely gives interviews, for example,
right?
But then she still opens the window in that sense through her music. That's rather than just doing interviews. And because I know that it's like the creation of the BeyHive, which is spelled BeyHive, is that came out of a forum where it was trying to look at what Beyonce was doing, where she was, what she was doing, and they started with the link of one of the people in her entourage who was helping her with a website, and he was tweeting out little bits of information, and then he ended up being on the forum, and like it all started from something called Beyonce World, and it had so it came out of the demise of Beyonce World, because Beyonce Camp actually engaged with that quite regularly. So she's finding those parts to actually engage with to build the correct narrative, I think. And then that Beyonce World posted unflattering photos, so she just cut it off. So then there was like this whole group of people looking for another place to congregate, and that's where the BeyHive started. And then it's expanded into like other areas of the internet, but that's where it started. Like people that are at the shows live stream it on their phone, so people on the BeyHive can watch it at home. And then they also figure out where she's shooting music videos, even though she keeps it a secret, so they can just get one photo. There's about 17,000 members apparently that's part of that group, and they often come after Beyonce's detractors. So she's leveraging that, and then like her fans are just deciding to take that. And
didn't you say that
degree.
Just like actual bees, they have different roles in the BeyHive?
Yeah,
like
so
some of them are about building Beyonce's image, and some of them are about attacking her opponents or something.
Yeah, so you have the worker bees. So there's three main types apparently. There's the worker bees who just feed the forum's most popular threads with information about Beyonce and little snippets of news that they know about, and they can trumpet that on other social media platforms. There's the honeybees who just flood comment sections with their with basically how in awe they are of Beyonce. And then there's the killer bees who take stock of whom they should target next.
Wow.
So a lot of the time is if somebody says something about Beyonce that is considered detrimental to her image, they'll flood the social media pages. But the funny thing is that they'll put lots of the bee emojis, like huge comments that have got lines and lines of just bees. And often it's a really coordinated and targeted attack. So I don't think she likes to identify with that part, but she identifies with that small group of people that actually seems to disseminate a lot of news about her anyway, which is a different way of doing it. For example, having to deal with, like Diana had to deal with the paparazzi. So
she seemed a little bit more out of control. I don't know what you think about that, Karen. Did you feel like Diana came across like she was a bit of a victim of the media attention, or have you got any thoughts on that?
No thoughtful thoughts on that.
Didn't pay a lot of attention to Diana.
No, but I mean the way that in recent, The Crown and various recent pieces of not documentary shows, I guess that she is depicted a bit like that she wasn't in as much control as it appears that Beyonce is of the narrative. She was very much I think she's being portrayed as more of a victim of it than using it to portray a particular persona.
And do you think the social media piece is new? Do you think that's helping Beyonce? Something that that Diana and others in earlier generations didn't have that ability to speak for themselves and not do a press conference. Like Diana had to pick someone she thought she could trust as an interviewer to tell her story, whereas Beyonce can use social media and she has all these fans that are protecting her. Do you think that's different?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because there's not one or a small group of people controlling the narrative. It's anybody can have a say, and in a movement like the BeyHive, there's a lot of people that you can influence quickly. Yeah, it's
fascinating how that's a good point. It's like it's not even taking a photo and then putting it in a magazine. It's actually instant. Filming a concert. I mean, I remember the days. I don't know if you remember going to concerts, but they used to tell us not to record it because they were trying to control the dissemination. Now it's almost like they want them to record it.
Well, that's true, but now they also a lot of stand-up comedians now have special bags that you put your phone in and they lock. Okay. And I actually had this when I went to see Chris Rock. And they put your phone in it and they lock it until the end of the show and then unlock it and you can take it back out.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, which is pretty...
It's different.
Yeah, a little bit draconian sometimes. But I found it also interesting that we talked about all those things that she did on Lemonade, but also at the Super Bowl 50, when it came to performing at the Super Bowl. She performed at the Super Bowl twice in the 2010s, and this was the second time. And she basically debuted the new song Formation from the Lemonade album, but she also made a very strong alignment with the African American movement that was happening at the time. And she actually came out in full regalia inspired by the Black Panthers to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Black Panthers. And that was considered somewhat controversial because the NFL is very... Like you cannot make any political statements in any performances that happen. So I found that kind of interesting that she's now... This is another thing that's very important to her, obviously. Even in the Beyonce album, she talked about the darker themes of miscarriage, because she had a miscarriage prior to having her daughter Blue Ivy. There's a lot of insecurities and motherhood. Now in Lemonade, she's dealing with Jay-Z's infidelity, but then also identifying herself with the African American issues, and also things like Colin Kaepernick, who kneeled. He was an NFL quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers and started kneeling during the national anthem in order to protest against police brutality. So she started to be really part of that as well. And then I know that both her and Jay-Z have donated to the Black Lives Movement chapters in all different areas as well. So she's really trying to possibly do a similar thing to Taylor Swift in terms of the egalitarianism, is that I have this platform. I need to, first of all, discover who myself is, but then also I need to help other people and bring other people along with me. And possibly having that community aspect too that you talked about previously, Karen, of I'm not going to do this on my own. I'm going to raise women up because this is what I really believe in.
Yeah. Oh, there's clearly intentionality about it, isn't it? Like as opposed to you brought up, Lady Di before. I don't think there was an intentional message that she was trying to portray in the media, but there's very much an intentionality. Well, it appears with Beyonce, doesn't it? That, and whether it's part of her identity formation, as she's starting to look at all of the things that have influenced her and the things that are in her heritage. So, actually exploring, the sort of different black, sort of movements in music in the past. She's bringing those in, and but yeah, like being very intentional about I've got a platform that I'm going to use to talk about feminist issues, but also about sort of Black Lives Matter type issues. That there's some real intentionality about that.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that, particularly with the motherhood issue, Karen, that's a very personal issue, but also part of that feminist idea that she's putting forward. Do you have any thoughts about her attempts to talk about having a career and being a mother at the same time? Like that's been a journey for women, hasn't it, over the last 40 or so years?
Yeah, and I think that in one of the albums, I don't know if it was Lemonade or after that, that there seems to be a real monogamy and real motherhood theme that's sort of weaving through a lot of that. I think she's a mother in a different time than when I first became a mother, but I think that some of the prevailing issues for women who choose to also have a career are that there's judgment no matter where you look, different forms of judgment. So I experienced, even within the church, there would be a group of people who would think you should stay home with your child, and there would be pressure from society, from that group of society for that. And equally, there would be pressure on the other side. You should do what you're skilled to do. You should be in the workforce, and there's that pressure as well. And in society, I think women are portrayed in all sorts of ways, and so there's societal pressure too. So I think Beyonce is making real statements about, it from that girl song and through some of the themes that are in these.
If I Were a Boy, that's the one that she really just
like there's a different experience of life, that is, if you're a girl, if you're a boy, there is different experience, and I think she's using her platform to say that there's societal pressure that shapes us in certain ways, but we can actually take control of the narrative. And we can do anything. We can rule the world. We can, those types of messages are certainly there. But I think it is in the context of there's real pressure, and it's pressure from all sorts of different expectations and angles, and people navigate that in different ways. But I think as a woman, and you guys can reflect on your experience. I'm not sure that it's only women that feel this, but there is guilt that follows you for all sorts of different things. Like if I make this choice, I feel guilty with this group of people. If I make this choice, I feel a different sort of guilt. And that can be really disempowering, that guilt. So, maybe part of her intention is to help people make choices without bringing that guilt with them.
Yeah. That's really helpful. It's interesting, isn't it, that she gets back to work really quickly after she has a baby to sort of embrace both sides of her identity, that she's a mother and she also is a singer as well.
Yeah.
In Homecoming, which is the 2019 Netflix documentary and album, it's a live performance, and as I said, it had all the high school bleachers behind her. It's shot over 2 weekends at Coachella in 2018. She was originally scheduled to do 2017 and then had to cancel because she fell surprisingly pregnant with twins. But then it also, in between the live performances, she wrote, directed and executive produced it herself. So after having twins, she's then trying to, in her opinion, needs to get into shape, write, direct and executive produce this incredible production, and then also perform it as well. So it was incredible. And it has all these little parts in between of how she managed to get there. And she actually, her diet basically consisted of fruit and vegetables. She was just, I'm like, no meat. She's like, no meat, no dairy, no fish. That was all she was eating. So when I was watching it with my wife, she was like, she must be hungry.
That's a really interesting insight. She must have been hungry.
And then she's bringing through the African American things too. She was the first African American woman to headline Coachella. She says in the documentary, I wanted to be a positive celebration of African American culture and bring our culture to Coachella, which I thought it was a really fascinating approach. She said, I studied my history, I studied my past, I put every mistake, all of my triumphs, all of my 22 career into a 2-hour homecoming performance. So she's creating her own homecoming. So I'm back. I'm back to the person that I wanted to be, and you're dealing with a lot of things, and motherhood is so difficult as when you're thrown into it straight away when you're having a baby, and then she's had twins, and then she's had this incredible career. Like there's a lot going on for her.
Yeah, but in an interesting sort of way, I wonder how much pressure, that additional pressure that puts on women. Like, look at what Beyonce is able to achieve. You should be too. So
right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, she's almost become like a superstar.
Well, that, and most of our lives are not. Yeah, like she's so driven, but also probably has a whole lot of help. That we don't.
Yeah, see. A lot of money too.
Yeah, and so I think sometimes it can backfire. That real desire to empower people can also put pressure on people, So I know a lot of younger women would probably look at her and go, I need to aspire to be able to do it all as well. I need to be a, great mum and a great whatever I do in the workplace. And that's a lot of pressure that society is putting on us as well.
Yeah, it is. Have you had to deal with that sort of pressure yourself when you've
absolutely.
run your own business and now as a pastor as well? And
absolutely. And and I think that it's easy, like you do want to be able to do it all, and the myth that society tells us is that we can and we have the right to. Not everybody is going to. I think we need to be freer to make the choices that are the best choices for us and not what society is expecting us to do. But I think that the constant juggle is, I don't feel like I'm doing any of this as well as I could be because I'm trying to juggle everything. And so, like that's not an easy juggle. And some people can do that effectively. Other people choose to not, and that's okay too. I think we probably need more messages in our churches, in our society, that says that all of the choices are available and whichever one you take is okay.
Do you think churches do put more pressure on women as well?
My experience, not so much from this current church, not from Soul Revival, but my experience has been that whichever choice you make, there are some people who are going to criticise and have think that you should be doing it differently. And in some sectors, those voices are probably louder than others. Some people might not outwardly criticise, but you feel that judgment at times. And so, I think we've got to become better at being supporters of each other, not critics of each other.
I like that, being supporters, building one another up. That's after all what the Bible encourages us to do, isn't it? Not tear each other down, but build each other up. Yeah.
I wonder if there's still a dichotomy for people that are really big fans of Beyonce too, because you're talking about there's a lot of that pressures, and perhaps they identify with her because she has to experience those pressures, but then maybe some of her art makes people think I should be even better. I should be what she's like.
And there's nothing wrong with being inspired, is there, to step into something bigger than you think you're possibly able to.
Yeah, and I think that's what the Polyphonic podcast sort of taps into, particularly with coming back to the Black Lives Matter stuff too. I think it's really interesting that she really makes a bold statement at the Super Bowl by dressing like the Black Panthers, because that's a really interesting semiotic or symbol to adopt. Going back to the 60s when the Black Panthers were around, there was a really interesting difference between the Martin Luther King part of the civil rights movement and the Malcolm X interpretation of the way forward. So Martin Luther King, being a Protestant minister himself, was talking about things like we need to love our white brothers and sisters, we need to go forward, and the colour of our skin shouldn't define us, we should just be defined by the content of our character. But on the other hand, Malcolm X, which interestingly he was coming from a different theological perspective too, being a Muslim as well, a recent convert to Islam, he had a different set of influences and saw the whole situation differently, and so he was perceived to be more militant than Martin Luther King and less conciliatory. So he was more arguing for a more forceful African-American voice at the time. And the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a bunch of young people that emerged from the grassroots in Oakland from San Francisco, and it was basically a bunch of young men to start off with, but then it became men and women who started this Black Panther Party, and their take on the whole situation was that they needed to provide answers to the policing measures that were being undertaken in Oakland, where young black people were targeted by police on occasions. And so they got themselves a van, they painted a big Black Panther on the side of their van, and then they carried guns around. So we've talked about this at an earlier podcast, but what was quite striking about that is the two guys, Huey particularly, that started this new initiative, understood the law because he was a law student, and he understood that by American law they were allowed to carry guns around as long as they didn't use them. So by actually carrying guns around, dressing with black berets and frizzing their hair out to be more African, wearing black leather jackets and dark sunglasses, driving around in a van rather, with a Black Panther on the side, they drove around looking for instances of police brutality, and if they saw any instances where they were observing the police being too harsh, they'd get out of the car with their guns and they'd stand there with their guns watching the police. And there's a famous instance where apparently they got out of the car when there was a black guy being beaten up in an alleyway, and they saw police beating this guy up, and they walked over to the police with carrying guns, and the policeman came over and said, "Is there a bullet in that chamber of the gun?" And Huey said, "No, LA law says we're not allowed to drive around in a car with a loaded firearm, so it isn't," and he cocks it, but it is now. And he didn't intend it in the initial instances to actually fire the gun. It was more an intimidation device, and it got so much publicity. They even eventually started chapters of Black Panthers all over America. They went onto the floor of the legislature in California when Ronald Reagan was the in charge of California at the time, and before he became president, and they went into the legislature all carrying guns, and so it actually descended pretty quickly into violence, though. And so there's this real strong voice of young people standing up saying we are not going to tolerate any abuse of our civil rights. Unlike Martin Luther King, they sided with Malcolm X. So for a little while there, the Black Panthers were actually bodyguards for Malcolm X. So for Beyonce to come out with dressed like Panthers, kind of, I think, I'm not an expert on this, but it occurs to me that's a very strong semiotic to suggest that she's connecting with that more visceral voice of civil rights of Malcolm X rather than the more conciliatory tone of Martin Luther King. And I think if you look at Black Lives Matter, it seems to me to be more of that Malcolm X kind of style rather. So for her to champion that is quite a strong statement, I think.
Yeah, I believe in Homecoming, there's actually Malcolm X. There's a Malcolm X quote that's played over and over again, which says, "The most disrespected person in America is the black woman."
Yeah.
And Beyonce is like interspersing different quotes, and it keeps going. So she's definitely. I think you're probably right. She's definitely identifying with that part of the movement. I was also going to say I found a really interesting quote from a woman who wrote an article on The Ringer where they rated the top 100 Beyonce songs, which is an effort in itself. But Kyla Marshall, she says, since 2016, she, as in Beyonce, hasn't just become more forthcoming about her blackness, but about her womanhood. She was always a beacon for girl power, but in a nondescript way that left out any mention of her own experience. By her own admission, the Beyonce of yesteryear was a young woman intent on pleasing everyone around her. Grown up, Bey is a mother of 3 who's died and been reborn in her marriage. She's been through some things, and people who have been through some things are generally more interesting than those who haven't. As such, it's hard to compare a song like Deja Vu, which she does with Jay-Z, to one like Bigger. They were made by totally different people, and yet they're each quintessentially Beyonce. One is an expert dance song, musical in every way, funky from the floor up, and the other is a capital M message. 25-year-old Beyonce probably knew then, as she sings now, that she was part of something way bigger, but it's only Bey of her late 30s who could convincingly show us that we all are that. I thought that was a really good summing up of that. But she's obviously speaking so many different aspects of culture that are really important to her and also to her own experience, Stu. As Christians, we're talking about critiquing embracing culture. How do we do that? And I know that you've done a lot of thinking around that recently.
Yeah, I think it'd be really good to move towards looking at what's happening, what's going on with Beyonce, to actually thinking a bit more about the why. I like to think about that, and we have been using Ian Hussey as a sociologist to help us to think about the why, and then after we think about why that might be happening sociologically, then to think biblically. And Ian Hussey embraces both those. Actually, it was Karen that introduced me to Ian Hussey just a little while ago, so I'm still reading his stuff and really finding it helpful in this podcast. But Karen, Ian Hussey brings up themes of any culture, that you can look at a culture and not stereotype a culture, but to come to understand it. Do you see any themes in Beyonce that Ian Hussey's used in his work? I mean, I'm thinking postmodernism and pluralism are two things he says is very are themes of our Western culture. Do you see any of that in her work?
I think she's embracing aspects of religion, or parts of, some of the morality things, the monogamy, the redemption themes that came out pretty clearly in her and Jay-Z's dealings with those, times of their life with infidelity. But at the same time, she's not embracing all of sort of the Christian faith. She's also embracing other aspects of religious movements, of other cultural movements. So I think, pluralism is probably one of the concepts that would that we're seeing being displayed in her,
in her work, because we've been trying to use, looking at different music icons to help us to unpack some of the things that Ian Hussey is saying that it's good for us as Christians to be aware of as we engage with culture, and as we're doing today. You know, we're not just embracing everything Beyonce is or critiquing everything she is. Ian Hussey's really helpful because he's saying the Bible writers will both critique and embrace culture. So it's, if we're going to do that, we need to have kind of, I suppose, some categories to look at. And as Karen was saying, the two things there, the pluralism and postmodernism. I mean, first of all, Beyonce and postmodernism, for those that aren't super familiar with what postmodernism is, just a little definition. Postmodernism is what it's not. And that's a bit confusing, but the whole idea of postmodernism is that we now live in an age that isn't modern. And the modern age can be defined as that time since the Industrial Revolution, right back in the early 1800s, where machines begin to become so powerful that they replace our relationships, and we can get more security from technology than we can from our community. And so that drives our individualism, because we can become more individualistic because we get more choices, and we become more dominated by science and scientific endeavour, and we became so dominated by the industrial machine that we've actually polluted our climate. And we're now talking about, can we roll back some of that, that over dependence on machinery and coal and fossil fuels. So it's actually killing our environment. But that whole idea of modernism is, science is king, and the institution is king and queen, and that hierarchical power is dominant, and we dominate the environment, not live at harmony with the environment. Postmodernism is questioning all those old ways of thinking and saying, yes, there's still science, we still need to be thinking scientifically, but has the church too closely aligned itself to that modern era and become a modern institution itself with its hierarchies? And so Beyonce is speaking into that context of saying, let's question the past, let's question tradition, and let's try and forge a new kind of society. And there's aspects of that are quite admirable, but there are aspects of that we would say, well, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And for example, taking bits and pieces of Christianity is actually a very postmodern thing to do, taking some and not others.
How they can coexist together, even though you're not embracing all of it, just taking bits of it. And I think one of the things that Hussey says about postmodernism is that it is that sort of impossible juxtaposition of things put together that don't normally sit together. And I think Lemonade is probably an example of where she's done that. So there's all these different genres on the one album. They wouldn't normally sit together in an album, but she's done that. So that's probably an example.
I think you could also say the majority of her career, there's been like that. She's talking about lots of different things that often sometimes contradict each other.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because on some of her songs, she's experimenting with 70s R&B, and then she's moving into 90s rock, and then she's like using lots of horns, and there's all these different juxtaposition of things. It's almost like in the song Love on Top, she's actually got almost like a structural thesis for postmodernism, because she's got like 4 key changes in the same song, and she's using all this variety, and that was so popular she won a Grammy out of that. And that, yet on the same album, she's got a 1980s diva song in Party. It's like a completely different style, and all of a sudden then she's sort of taking past styles and not just relying on trying to reinvent those things, but actually creating something new out of those things. And I think what's helpful when you look at that is another Hussey category is pluralism. So postmodernism is saying we're not modern anymore, and we're rejecting those traditions and hierarchies, and in its place we're putting a more pluralistic society rather than a more homogeneous society, which the homogeneous unit principle picks up on, because it's identifying all these different homogeneous units in society that somehow have to work out how to live together. And there's a really interesting example of what Hussey talks about with pluralism, to give a bit of a definition for us today, from the Canberra Times of 2015. I might just read this out because I think it's helpful for us to understand it. In Canberra Times in 2015, they write, "What prevents Australia from descending into destructive, hateful divides is tolerance. It works in 2 ways. We accept that other people hold different views, but we also accept their right to share those views, even, and this is where it can be difficult, if their views show little tolerance for others. These 2 elements of tolerance not these two elements of tolerance do not always sit comfortably together. But pluralist countries rely on their citizens' ability to respect difference. It is that which makes our society work. So I find it interesting in Beyonce that she has pluralist elements in her songs. It's almost, for her fans, an articulation of how to live in harmony, at least with these music styles, and how to bring those things together. But it's also saying something broader, that we need to work out as human beings how to live together. But at the same time, she has these strong voices in feminism and speaking up for the oppressed, and also within the Black Lives Matter movement, where she's seeking to stand up for the oppressed as well. And it's interesting to see how the church interacts with those two issues, and not always comfortably. Like I think it'd be interesting if we thought a bit more theologically now and think like how do we engage with that. And I think the shock absorber is really helpful, because again, not wanting to sound like a broken record, but it's about getting young people and older people to have a space where we can talk about these issues together. And it's important that we do that so that we can look at what's happening, ask ourselves, why is this happening, and then think biblically together. I mean, I remember growing up, there wasn't much space for conversation around popular music. And in fact, in our local church, we weren't allowed to have guitars and drums in the church, because some of our older generation saints still hadn't got their head around this new rock and roll music style, even by the 1980s. So 20 years after rock and roll came along, they still thought the drums were syncopation and that was of the devil, and we shouldn't bring that into the church. So I think we've come a long way from those kind of days of that bleak conversation, which was basically, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do this, which is what we do. But the shock absorber is saying, let's let the young people talk about their latest Beyonce record that they're listening to, and let's also reflect on that and say, oh, that's an interesting reflection of our broader society. And now how do we think theologically? I don't know, Karen, have you got any thoughts on anything biblically that we could think about in that?
We're in the middle of, or just sort of at the beginning of a study, a series in Judges, and one of the things that I was thinking about then as you were speaking is that in Judges we see that increasing corruption and increasing, ungodliness of a group of people, of the Israelites. And that's this cycle of God providing them with, they call out to God eventually. He provides them with a judge who both saves, who sort of overcomes the oppressor and saves them. But the theme of the judge who's given to the Israelites is reflective of the culture. So as they're getting more corrupt, these judges are getting more corrupt. And so I think we're seeing some of that in our society too, that those who we, revere, who we look up to, who become major influences of our world are reflective of our world, So...
that's really interesting. So her leadership is sort of, you can see a parallel there.
Yeah. So they might be making changes and adapting culture and leading culture, but they're also reflecting the culture. And so from a Christian perspective, I think we need to critique, what aspects of culture are actually really more those aspects of culture that we see in Judges being condemned rather than being upheld. So it was, that we see the cycle of those judges come in, the oppression ends, and there's this period of peace. And that period of peace is where things are back to the way they sort of should be. And so, I think that would potentially be one frame that we might want to think through as we look at, the things that are leading our culture, the characteristics that we see most prevalent in our culture. Are they more consistent with that period of peace, or are they consistent with that period of oppression? And
that's interesting.
Ungodliness.
And it's interesting that she's thinking in terms of some political frameworks to try and answer problems of oppression. But then when we jump in the New Testament, look at the Gospels, and we see, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, it's just incredibly articulate and beautiful how Jesus unpacks the difference between the kingdom of heaven and earthly kingdoms, and he contrasts earthly power with the power of God. That he sort of almost subverts our power structures. And when he starts off by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," it's an incredible statement to say that if we understand our own humanity, that we're fallen and we're sinful and we grieve at our own sin, then we're actually able to turn to God and look to Him for solutions to the human problems that we've created ourselves within our societies. And it's not to say we shouldn't look for political solutions to problems that we have, but we need to be careful we don't become idolatrous in our search for political answers, like the people of Israel were looking to the Canaanite human-made idolatry to solve their issues instead of relying solely on Yahweh. So I think with Jesus we see such a great leader that we can stay focused on how he travels through a pluralistic world himself. I mean, one of the things that Hussey makes an interesting point is that the New Testament was written to a pluralistic culture, that in the Roman culture there were all these different thought systems all coexisting. In the Roman world they were being oppressed routinely by the Romans when they saw them as a threat to their dominant system, which is always the case, I suppose. But in the Greek system, when you look at cities like Ephesus or some of the Corinth, other places there where the gospel takes root, Corinth, for example, is a far more pluralistic society even than Rome, and there's all these different ideas. It's like a marketplace of ideas, and I think it's interesting to see how the gospel was preached into those contexts. It gives us a lot of focus for how we can continue to preach the same undying message of the gospel without changing it, but into these different pluralistic contexts.
And that quote you read earlier, Joel, where Beyonce is saying that or someone was saying that black women are the most oppressed, black and women, most sort of.
There's a quote from Malcolm X.
The thinking about that cycle of that we're talking about in Judges, that the answer, the solution to it isn't more violence and more activism, it's God providing a way out. And so I think that's another thing that we can be sort of reflecting on, that ultimately it makes sense to stand up against oppression. And we, God calls us to do that as well. But ultimately it's like it's not in our solutions that we're going to find the ultimate solution.
That's really helpful, because I think one of the things that Beyonce's done and the Black Lives Matter movement has done is drawn more attention to the plight of Aboriginal communities in Australia, for example. And the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody can be so frustrating in a sense that we've actually put a spotlight on the facts that Indigenous people are overrepresented in our prison system, and so many of them have died in incarceration, and yet sometimes you look at that and you think, what have we done to fix that? So I suppose the voice of people like Beyonce is saying, hey, don't forget about this. Like, this is a really important issue.
These things are,
some of their solutions we may embrace and critique different solutions. Some Christians, like, for myself, for example, I'm more comfortable, I suppose, because I'm a Protestant Christian, I'm more comfortable within the framework of Martin Luther King as he looks at some of these issues, rather than the Malcolm X kind of school of thought. But I think it's interesting that we can have that conversation, and it's like interesting that we have so much to offer as Christians, that we can offer hope in the midst of this, that Jesus came and he lived with us, he lived amongst us, and he saw oppression. Like, he called out the soldiers for the oppression that they dealt out to people. He called out the religious leaders in the Jewish community who were oppressing people who were just trusting their leadership when they were bad leaders, like the judges were. But yet Jesus gives us this clear way, and I think it's fascinating that we keep coming back to John 14, but Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through me. He was very confidently claiming that he could solve our problems. And I think as Christians, we don't want to shut down conversations because we find them uncomfortable, or maybe because the people who are raising the topics may not come from our particular point of view. But it's the idea that we can have a conversation around that and then look to Jesus for our answers is really exciting, I think.
I think talking about that conversation, we had a question sent in from Callan, and you can send any questions you have, guys, to joel@shockersorbit.com.au. Callan, who's a friend of ours, he said that he was inspired to write you this question after listening to the end of season 3, where we talked about Squid Game and the conversation you had with your son Eli, Stu. And his question is, how do we help church members to have those kind of conversations? It seems hard enough for those in paid ministry to enter into that with open curiosity and bring biblical wisdom to bear. But for most, we want to close it down and just say, oh, don't do it, because we're just uncomfortable and out of our depth and we don't know what to say. Or perhaps the idea of discipleship is Christians just do this and not do this. So his question is, in terms of the shock absorber, how have we helped people, youth leaders, any kind of leaders that we have, or just parishioners, to have those organic discipleship conversations?
I think part of it is telling stories and sharing stories of how we approach that particular issue. I mean, I'd be interested, Karen, have you got any thoughts about, as you brought up your two kids, how you had those difficult cultural conversations with kids at all? Have you got any experience in that yourself?
I think that a particular example doesn't come to mind, but I think that the reason why you can have those conversations with your kids is because you've got a history of relationship, and it's based on that solid trust that, you know, we can go to those difficult places where we need to talk about something that's not comfortable. So in our churches, we are more able to do that when we have a basis of a unified, sort of cohesive community of people who know each other, who've journeyed through things together. And then we can explore those hard things because there's a bit of grace that people might give us, that when we have differences of opinion, and we can have those conversations without the relationships breaking apart. But in churches where, and we've talked about that a lot, that the shock absorber is what helps us to have those long-term, low-key relational sort of characteristics of our culture. So we can just have a lounge room discussion where we say we're going to actually talk about a really hard topic, and we know that there's going to be differences of opinion. And so as I reflected on my kids, that's the same type of thing. We know that we're a family. We know that doesn't really matter if we disagree here, but we can delve into this because of that solid foundation of relationship that we have.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And you raise the second point I was going to raise, actually, which is that we can model how to do that as well, that we actually put it into practice, not just teach it. We can teach it, but Karen, we just recently we had a really interesting forum we had with our young adults on a Saturday night with regard to women preaching in the church as well. Did you want to share a bit about that? Because I think that was also a really good modelling opportunity to talk about something we can find that Christians can disagree with sometimes. Yeah,
I mean, I think, again, it's because we were able to have that conversation because the people who were in the room trusted each other, had invested in each other in terms of, relational capital. So it wasn't to a room of people who didn't know each other. I don't know that it would have been helpful if we were in a different place to have two leaders of the church have a different opinion. But we were able to have that conversation. You and I have a different view on, the answer to that question. And we were able to sort of graciously have that conversation, acknowledge that there's differences, acknowledge that we don't always have to agree on everything, to still be unified, to still show love to each other, to still be able to serve together. But I do think it's hard to have those conversations in a church community where that's not the case, and it can fracture relationships if people see their leaders disagreeing or they have disagreements with each other. It can break relationships apart. So I think you have to, wade carefully into, like in terms of Callan's question, wade carefully into the discussion, but and choose wisely when to have it. But you've got to do some work on establishing an environment that's going to be conducive to having that discussion.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that some of our younger women are really thinking through some of the issues that Beyonce has raised, and then for us to say, well, why don't we all have a talk about it? One of the things we've lost in our culture at the moment is that group conversation that we used to do more easily in previous generations. Unfortunately, social media has replaced that forum that we used to have as communities to talk through issues. But we've tried to recapture that in our church, that, like Karen said, our young people hang out with each other every Saturday night around the Word of God and socially, and we interact with that so they know us and we're safe. Yeah. It's not to say that conversations aren't going to be messy sometimes and hard, but with Karen and I, for example, that we both agree on the fundamental gospel tenets, that we then can say that that there are things in the Bible that it's okay to ask questions, it's okay to explore that together in a safe way, and that if if we can explore that together, it's exciting to know that in a Jesus-shaped community, we're all a priesthood of all believers, and we're all sitting under the authority of God's word, and God's word is the authority, and we can talk about that together and try and work out how to express that. So within our families, I think the same thing. I think if parents can be modelling to the children that you can have discussions, safe discussions about things that you disagree on, when it comes to their voice, we can listen to them, and they don't feel like they have to agree with everything we say straight away. They can journey towards that, or maybe develop their own ideas on some things.
Yeah, because I think Hussey talks about the importance of trust, like part of the institutional, some of these concepts that Hussey talks about, because of losing of trust. And so, if we can have an environment where trust is restored and maintained, then we can. It's a robust environment where we can explore some hard stuff.
In relation to Callan's question, what something that he might be able to do in his particular ministry context to perhaps build that trust a little bit more?
I think the great thing is to encourage the youth leaders not to just see youth ministry as a part-time job that they just happen to be doing, like they'd be working at Woolies or something, to not think, I'll do this for a couple of years and then someone else can have a go because I've done my bit. But to build a sense that there's this ongoing long-term low-key relational strategy where the youth leaders are actually in relationship with each other and working out what it is to be Christian together, and then growing the young people up into that relationship. Now, that's not to say that every youth leader has to be a long-term youth leader, but if there is an opportunity for some of the youth leaders to literally be a Christian peer group. I mean, Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, I'll call you my friends if you do what I say, which is to love one another. So if there is a clear expression of that love from the youth leaders, the young people can see a relational reality to the moral constructs and the ethical conversations. It's not just a philosophical conversation, it's actually a lifestyle that we're talking about. And then to be included in that on a weekly basis, as Karen said, where people can build trust and what we like to call a spiritual bank account. If you're depositing in someone's life regularly, then you can make a withdrawal every now and again without completely decimating the bank account. But unfortunately, sometimes our churches are so structured that the young people don't get to see the older people living their lives because they're in a separate service. So I like intergenerational ministry because it lets everyone be in the same room together so that they can all hear those conversations and be a part of it. So to structure an opportunity or a space where old and young can have a meal together regularly, and then every now and again in that informal environment to have a formal forum on some safe issues that are really easy to talk about. That means that over time you can build up trust so that you can then have difficult conversations sometimes too.
Like a Beyonce appreciation party or something.
We could have that. That would be a fun thing to do.
And I think it's also about providing the space and the time to have those safe conversations, but also to be prepared to listen. I think that's one of the things, like in direct answer to sort of Callum's question and your example with Eli and Squid Games, you did take the time to listen to his perspective. And so I think that we're more likely to be heard if we listen first. So I think that's another just practical thing that. But also I think we've got to find ways to actually call people to a higher level of discipleship. Like that it's not about just accepting and tolerating people's, apathy or spiritual immaturity. That there's a place, and we've got to model it obviously first, but there's a place to actually, in those safe relationships, to actually call people up to step up. We're actually called to be growing. It's not okay to just sit in a place where we're immature. We should be growing, and we're only going to have credibility to do that if we're modelling it ourselves. So we need to be the people who we're calling our younger people to aspire to be, but be prepared to listen to their journey and their struggles, and sensitively talk our journey into that space.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful actually, because Christianity is countercultural. It's not cultural. So we're not doing the same thing as Beyonce trying to reflect the culture and then build on that. We're actually doing something different. We're listening to Jesus as he has set up a new framework, which sometimes can be confronting for adults and for young people. So we're not just trying to, as Karen said, we're listening to young people and encouraging them to listen to God. So not just listen to us, but we're all trying to listen to what God has to say. And so I think part of it with Eli with the Squid Games was there was a point in the conversation after I had heard his impressions of it, which really helped. And it wasn't just a ticker box thing. I wasn't, listen to Eli, then tell him what I think. It's not that. It's like, listen, share with him what I'm thinking, but then together go, well, I wonder what the Bible has to say about this, and to build a culture where we're trying to seek to find answers in the Bible that are authoritative. And the problem, I think, which we might get to in future podcasts, is sometimes I think we can very cleverly employ certain hermeneutic devices and certain theological devices to almost make the Bible say whatever we want it to say, and emphasize certain parts over other parts if it suits our argument. So we've got to be careful that we come humbly to the Word of God and be willing to be shaped by it, need to be challenged. And I think if we had that humility to adjust our thinking to God's thinking, then that's a really good place to start as well. But yeah, that thinking is listening is really good, Karen, I reckon. Yeah,
listening to each other. And I always like the fact that you talk about, Stu, is that we're not just reconciled to God, but we're reconciled to each other. So that allows us to be able to, regardless of the age or the situation or what we're talking about, that we can actually be in the same space to be able to listen to each other and really understand, or try and understand what we're discussing there. So anything else to add for this episode, guys? Just
one thing on that is, like, I think coming back to that Black Lives Matter theme of Beyonce, which I think we can pick up in future episodes as we look at some other artists. I grew up in the Sutherland Shire surrounded by Anglo people, and I didn't know any Aboriginal people growing up until we moved to the country in Narrandera in New South Wales. And in Narrandera, half the town were Indigenous and half the town were white. So I had lots of friends at school that were Indigenous friends. In fact, one of my best friends was an Indigenous student, and my dad had moved our family to Narrandera, which is in country New South Wales in Australia. New South Wales is about 8 hours away from where I live now in Sydney, where I grew up. And we moved down to Narrandera. And when Dad's time as a bank manager at Narrandera came to an end, we moved back to Sydney. My big question is, where are all the Indigenous people? Like, I didn't notice it before. And then when I realised that it was actually Anglo people who had just basically moved all the Aboriginal people out, and all the Dharawal people we'd taken all their land, and it's quite a confronting thing to actually see that, and it made me feel very sorry. And where I live now at Grays Point, there's actually a scar tree at the bottom of my block. That is, a scar tree is where Indigenous people have carved a canoe out of the bark of a tree, and then when they've taken the bark off the tree, it's left a scar, and that stays for hundreds of years. And this scar has probably been there for over 100 years. And the council has actually not let the people who built on that particular block knock it down, so it's still there. So I often talk to my boys about that and say, see that scar tree? Like, this land we live on now is where the Dharawal people lived. And so that can be quite confronting for us to actually come to terms with the oppression that our culture has enacted on others and continues to do so. So I think it can be quite confronting for us as Christians to say that some of the things we love about our culture might actually not be that good. And that's one example, but there's others as well. We're very materialistic, we're very consumeristic, and being willing to read the Bible and be confronted by it and changed by God's word is a good place for us to be if we're going to expect our young people to do that as well.
I think so. And I think to wrap up this episode, there was a quote by someone in Entertainment Weekly, and he noticed how Beyonce was the defining pop star for the 2010s, and they stated, "No one dominated music in the 2010s like Queen Bey," explaining that her songs, album rollouts, stage presence, social justice initiatives, and disruptive public relations strategy have influenced the way we've viewed music since 2010. But in reflecting on what you've just said there, Stu, that not everything in our culture is good, that we should firstly be listening to Jesus and encouraging others to listen to God, and then finding those authoritative answers in the Bible. I think that's a really good point to finish on, is that's what we can embrace and critique culture by doing that, is that we'll see what's happening in culture, but first of all, we're going to listen to Jesus. So I think that's a really good way to sum it up. Thank you for joining us, Stu. Really appreciate it. Really great conversation. So thank you very much. And Karen, thank you very much for joining us as well. It was awesome.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thank you very much. Anyway, we'll finish up with the one way. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for your thoughts too, bro. One way.
Thank you.